We are considering suffering from the point of view of the Samkhya Darshana. And Samkhya and Yoga are two darshanas which are somewhat intertwined in the Hindu religious tradition. And Samkhya depends on Yoga, and Yoga depends on Samkhya. And Samkhya means a very systematic, analytical approach to understanding reality, going all the way up to ultimate reality. Not only understanding the Panchabhutas and cosmic creation, but digging deeper, going all the way up to what one calls ultimate reality and the source of creation. So many people have asked me over the long many years that in Samkhya Darshana, they allude to three kinds of sufferings. They bear separate names, Adhi Bhautika and Adhi Daivika and Adhyatmika. So these are the three kinds of, they are the Sanskrit terms, and I'll take them one after the other. And I'm doing this mainly to make clear where Amanaska Yoga stands with respect to human suffering understood in the widest and deepest sense. That's my intention. Now, let's take the first kind of suffering alluded to in Samkhya. It is Adhi Bhautika. Now, this is a kind of suffering which is tied up with man's connection to the Panchabhutas, namely to the water element, the air element, and the fire element, and so on. So, it is obviously conceived that suffering can befall man through a forest fire, for example, through a flood, for example, through too much of heavy rainfall, for example, and so on. And sometimes suffering can also come through a scorpion bite, or through the bite of a poisonous snake, or a wild animal coming and mauling us. So there are innumerable ways in which suffering can arise in man, falling under the category Adhi Bhautika. Now, there is a second classification of suffering that is called Adhi Daivika, and this is tied up with fate or the act of deities and gods, which is supposed to be beyond the ken of human beings, and through an act of a particular deity or act of a particular god or act of fate, something may befall a person, like a disease may befall a person, or a misfortune may befall a person. He may lose his job, or he may be exiled from his home country, or there may be dishonor and disgrace, and or his marriage may break up. Anything can happen through some misfortune in fate. Now, that is called Adhi Daivika, the second class of sufferings. And the third class is what is very pertinent to us and on which we have to concentrate, and that is Adhyatmika. So what do we mean by this term? So Atma means self, and with specific reference to the inner world, to the self of man and to his antaranga, to his field of inner consciousness and so on. And obviously, when a person is depressed, or when a person suffers an emotional hurt, or when a person has got hatred, he's suffering because of hatred, and he doesn't know what to do with that fire of hatred, or he's into a great deal of negativity, and he doesn't know what to deal with it. All that would come into or there is tremendous craving. He is craving for something, he is craving for a pleasure, he is craving for a boon, and he is not getting that. So because of that, there is a turmoil in consciousness. There's a great abhinivesha, a craving, and which is not fulfilled. And therefore, there is inner suffering. And that would go by the name of adhyatmika. Now, people think that this is probably a legitimate and a traditional way to look at suffering, even though I like to mention that this is not the only way in which we can look at the full pantheon of sufferings. There are alternative perceptions, alternative classifications of sufferings. There are different ways of looking at it. For example, in Jyotisha, which is another independent framework which is not actually considered to be a darshana in Sanatana Dharma, even though it is a legitimate darshana, you develop a much greater and widespread understanding of the variety of human sufferings that are possible. We won't go into that now, but that's probably, we can discuss all of that in a later occasion. But let's look at adhyatmika kind of suffering, the suffering in the inner world. Now, the important point for us to note is, even though some suffering can arise because we have a clash with the 5 primordial elements, the Panchabhutas, from the Adhi Bhautika sector, or we may have suffering which is befalling us from the Adhi Daivika realm. Ultimately, it has to translate into suffering in the inner consciousness of man. Whatever may be the direction from which it is coming, it may come from the water element, it may come from the fire element, it may come through a stroke of misfortune, but ultimately the final destination and the final station where the suffering arrives is in the inner realm. So, in the Adhyatmika realm, and that is the realm with which Amanaska Yoga is concerned. And that is the realm of suffering with which the world teacher Sri J. Krishnamurti, he was primarily concerned throughout his life. And how to understand that suffering and how to observe that suffering, how to understand it, and if possible, how to bring the entire momentum of that suffering to an irrevocable finale and a closure. So that was the world teacher Krishnamurti's original intention. And the same intention prevails in Amanaska Yoga, which is my understanding of the world teacher's work. And so we've got to understand that whatever may be the initial genesis of suffering, ultimately it arrives in the inner realm of our consciousness, and where the final suffering transpires. So the Adhyatmika suffering is of the greatest concern for us in Amanaska Yoga. Thank you for listening. Namaste.